friends, welcome back. It's Christina Wainwright, the manager at the Pacific Beach Library. Thank you for joining me for the start of our third week of reading The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas together. Let's see. Today we have an awesome recap because exciting things happened last week. I think I need to consult a thesaurus. I feel like I say the word exciting too often, but it's such an exciting book. It's really hard to resist it. Momentous? Maybe momentous things happened last week. We'll go ahead and discuss those in a second. Let's go ahead and start out by having a little bit of tea. Oh, I see there's Ginny Weasley. Oh my goodness, I hope that's like a Ginny Weasley reference. I'm sorry, I hope it's good to see you. It's good to meet you. So today the tea that I'm having, it's a green tea with a peppermint flavor. I'm not sure if I steeped it long enough. I hope it has enough flavor. If not, you know what, let's just pour out like half a cup. And then if I need more later on, once it's had a longer chance to steep. I love all mint teas. They just smell so good. That is nice, but I think it could steep a little bit longer, but that is nice. All right, so let's talk a little bit about our book. What happened last week? Actually, before we get to the book, let's talk about a little bit of frivolous stuff. So the frivolous things I was going to share is that tomorrow is Bastille Day, July 14th. It commemorates the storming of the Bastille by the revolutionaries in France and marked the beginning of the revolution, followed by the Napoleonic reign, then followed later on by the Bourbon period that we're reading about now in our book. But again, if you're interested in doing anything special tomorrow for Bastille Day, I have made some macarons, as I mentioned in the other thread I would try to do. They're okay. By that I mean they taste delicious, but they don't look great. But they'll do. So I'll be bringing macaron tomorrow. If anyone else wants to have any special treats in honor of Bastille Day, we can do that. So, but either way, we will have our lovely French book to discuss. And in Friday's chapters of The Count of Monte Cristo, momentous things happened. There were two chapters. We read chapters 18 and chapter 19. In chapter 18, The Treasure, it was about Dantes going in and speaking with the Abbé Faria, who revealed to him how he had worked for the Spada family. And the Spada family had long ago had a lot of wealth, but it had sort of disappeared over the years and they didn't know where it was. The Abbé Faria was bequeathed a book from the last count, I believe it was, and the last heir of the Spada family. And in this, he found a little piece of paper that he was burning for, like, to light a candle one day. And when he got that little piece of paper near the heat, words appeared on it. So it had been written with a special ink. And basically, this revealed to him the secret of the treasure, including that the treasure was buried on the island of Monte Cristo. And because there were no other heirs, the Abbé had been on the point of going to retrieve that treasure when he was imprisoned, first in Italy and then in France. But now, knowing that he'll never be able to escape from the Chateau d'If because of his health, he gives this gift to Edmond Dantes. In the following chapter, which I can't remember what it was called in the version that we're reading on the Project Gutenberg version that I'm reading on our tablet, but in this version from the Everyman Library, I remember it had a different title name, and in this one there was no subtlety. It was called The Death of the Abbé. So they are not into spoilers here. No spoilers alerts. So in The Death of the Abbé has a third attack, and he has just enough time to say goodbye to Edmund and to say again that he needs to avail himself of this fortune to go to Monte Cristo, and that, you know, he's loved him as his son and he is glad to have met Edmund. It's a beautiful scene. And so then he dies. Edmund just gets away in time before the jailers come back, and when they see his body, they prove to themselves that it's dead, and they speak about how they're going to bury him that evening, or they're going to perhaps bury isn't the right thing, but they're going to take care of his body that evening. And so they leave his body wrapped in a bag, in a fabric sack. And so with that, where we left off in the end of chapter 19, Edmond Dantes was just about to re-enter the Abbé's cell. Okay, so here we go. Chapter 20. Oops, let me go back to this version. Yes. Okay, so chapter 20. Today we're going to read two chapters, chapter 20 and 21. So let's start with chapter 20, which is The Cemetery of the Chateau d'If. On the bed, at full length and faintly illuminated by the pale light that came from the window, lay a sack of canvas, and under its rude folds was stretched a long and stiffened form. It was Faria's last winding sheet, a winding sheet which, as the turnkey said, cost so little. Everything was in readiness. A barrier had been placed between Dantès and his old friend. No longer could Edmund look into those wide open eyes which had seemed to be penetrating the mysteries of death. No longer could he clasp the hand which had done so much to make his existence blessed. Faria, the beneficent and cheerful companion with whom he was accustomed to live so intimately, no longer breathed. He seated himself on the edge of that terrible bed and fell into melancholy and gloomy reverie. Alone. He was alone again. Again condemned to silence. Again face to face with nothingness. Alone. Never again to see the face. Never again to hear the voice of the only human being who united him to earth. Was not Faria's fate the better, after all, to solve the problem of life at its source, even at the risk of horrible suffering? The idea of suicide, which his friend had driven away and kept away by his cheerful presence, now hovered like a phantom over the abbé's dead body. If I could die, he said, I should go where he goes, and should assuredly find him again. But how to die? It is very easy, he went on with a smile. I will remain here, rush on the first person that opens the door, strangle him, and then they will guillotine me. But excessive grief is like a storm at sea, where the frail bark is tossed from the depths to the top of the wave. Dantès recoiled from the idea of so infamous a death, and passed suddenly from despair to an ardent desire for life and liberty. Die? Oh, no, he exclaimed, not die now, after having lived and suffered so long and so much. Die? Yes, had I died years ago, but now to die would be indeed to give way to the sarcasm of destiny. No, I want to live. I shall struggle to the very last. I will yet win back the happiness of which I have been deprived. Before I die, I must not forget that I have my executioners to punish, and perhaps, too, who knows, some friends to reward. Yet they will forget me here, and I shall die in my dungeon, like Faria. As he said this, he became silent and gazed straight before him, like one overwhelmed with a strange and amazing thought. Suddenly, he arose, lifted his hands to his brow as if his brain were giddy, paced twice or thrice round the dungeon, and then paused abruptly by the bed. Just God, he muttered, whence comes this thought? Is it from thee? Since none but the dead pass freely from this dungeon, let me take the place of the dead. Without giving himself time to reconsider his decision, and indeed that he might not allow his thoughts to be distracted from his desperate resolution, he bent over the appalling shroud, opened it with the knife which Faria had made, drew the corpse from the sack, and bore it along the tunnel to his own chamber, laid it on his couch, tied around its head the rag he wore at night around his own, covered it with his counterpane, once again kissed the ice-cold brow, and tried vainly to close the resisting eyes, which glared horribly, turned the head towards the wall so that the jailer might, when he brought the evening meal, believe that he was asleep, as was his frequent custom, entered the tunnel again, drew the bed against the wall, returned to the other cell, took from the hiding place the needle and thread, flung off his rags that they might feel only naked flesh beneath the coarse canvas, and getting inside the sack, placed himself in the posture in which the dead body had been laid, and sewed up the mouth of the sack from the inside. He would have been discovered by the beating of his heart if by any mischance the jailers had entered at that moment. Dantès might have waited until the evening visit was over, but he was afraid that the governor would change his mind and order the dead body to be removed earlier. In that case, his last hope would have been destroyed. Now his plans were fully made, and this is what he intended to do. If while he was being carried out, the grave diggers should discover that they were burying alive instead of a dead body, Dantès did not intend to give them time to recognize him, but with a sudden cut of the knife, he meant to open the sack from top to bottom, and profiting by their alarm, escape. If they tried to catch him, he would use his knife to better purpose. If they took him to the cemetery and laid him in a grave, he would allow himself to be covered with earth, and then, as it was night, the grave diggers could scarcely have turned their backs before he would have worked his way through the yielding soil and escaped. He hoped that the weight of earth would not be so great that he could not overcome it. If he was detected in this and the earth proved too heavy, he would be stifled. And then, so much the better. All would be over. Dantes had not eaten since the preceding evening, but he had not thoughts of hunger, nor did he think of it now. His situation was too precarious to allow him even time to reflect on any thought but one. The first risk that Dantes ran was that the jailer, when he brought him his supper at 7 o'clock, might perceive the change that had been made. Fortunately, 20 times at least, from misanthropy or fatigue, Dantes had received his jailer in bed, and then the man placed his bread and soup on the table and went away without saying a word. This time the jailer might not be as silent as usual, but speak to Dantes, and seeing that he received no reply, go to the bed, and thus discover all. When 7 o'clock came, Dantes's agony really began. His hand, placed upon his heart, was unable to redress its throbbings, while with the other he wiped the perspiration from his temples. From time to time chills ran through his whole body and clutched his heart in a grasp of ice. Then he thought he was going to die. Yet the hours passed on without any unusual disturbance, and Dantes knew that he had escaped the first peril. It was a good augury. At length, about the hour the governor had appointed, footsteps were heard on the stairs. Edmund felt that the moment had arrived, summoned up all his courage, held his breath, and would have been happy if at the same time he could have repressed the throbbing of his veins. The footsteps, they were double, paused at the door, and Dantes guessed that the two gravediggers had come to seek him. This idea was soon converted into certainty when he heard the noise they made in putting down the hand-bier. The door opened, and a dim light reached Dantes's eyes through the coarse sack that covered him. He saw two shadows approach his bed, a third remaining at the door with a torch in its hand. The two men, approaching the ends of the bed, took the sack by its extremities. "He's heavy, though, for an old and thin man," said one as he raised the head. "They say that every year adds 1/2 pound to the weight of the bones," said another, lifting the feet. "Have you tied the knot?" inquired the first speaker. "What would be the use of carrying so much more weight?" was the reply. "I can do that when we get there." "Yes, you're right," replied the companion. "What's the knot for?" thought Dantes. They deposited the supposed corpse on the bier. Edmund stiffened himself in order to play the part of a dead man, and then the party, lighted by the man with the torch, who went first, ascended the stairs. Suddenly, he felt the fresh and sharp night air, and Dantes knew that the mistral was blowing. It was a sensation in which pleasure and pain were strangely mingled. The bearers went on for 20 paces, then stopped, putting the bier down on the ground. One of them walked away, and Dantes heard his shoes striking on the pavement. "Where am I?" he asked himself. "Really, he is by no means a light load," said the other bearer, sitting on the edge of the hand-barrow. Dantes's first impulse was to escape, but fortunately he did not attempt it. "Give us a light," said the other bearer, "or I shall never find what I am looking for." The man with the torch complied, although not asked in the most polite terms. "What can he be looking for?" thought Edmund. "The spade, perhaps?" An exclamation of satisfaction indicated that the grave-digger had found the object of his search. "Here it is at last," he said. "Not without some trouble, though." "Yes," was the answer, "but it has lost nothing by waiting." As he said this, the man came towards Edmund, who heard a heavy, metallic substance laid down beside him, and at the same moment a cord was fastened round his feet with sudden and painful violence. "Well, have you tied the knot?" inquired the gravedigger, who was looking on. "Yes, and pretty tight too, I can tell you," was the answer. "Move on, then," and the bier was lifted once more, and they proceeded. They advanced 50 paces farther, and then stopped to open a door, then went forward again. The noise of the waves dashing against the rocks on which the chateau is built reached Dantes's ear distinctly as they went forward. "Bad weather," observed one of the bearers. "Not a pleasant night for a dip in the sea." "Why, yes, the abbé runs a chance of being wet," said the other, and then there was a burst of brutal laughter. Dantes did not comprehend the jest, but his hair stood erect on his head. "Well, here we are at last," said one of them. "A little farther, "A little farther," said the other. "You know very well that the last was stopped on his way, dashed on the rocks, and the governor told us next day that we were careless fellows." They ascended 5 or 6 more steps, and then Dantès felt that they took him, one by the head and the other by the heels, and swung him to and fro. "1," said the grave-diggers, "2, 3, and at the same instant Dantès felt himself flung into the air like a wounded bird, falling with a rapidity that made his blood curdle. Although drawn downwards by the heavy weight which hastened his rapid descent, it seemed to him as if the fall lasted for a century. At last, with a horrible splash, he darted like an arrow into the ice-cold water, and as he did so he uttered a shrill cry, stifled in a moment by his immersion beneath the waves. Dantès had been flung into the sea and was dragged into its depths by a 36-pound shot tied to his feet. The sea is the cemetery of the Château d'If. Chapter 21. The Island of Tiboulen. Dantès, although stunned and almost suffocated, had sufficient presence of mind to hold his breath, and as his right hand, prepared as he was for every chance, held his knife open, he rapidly ripped up the sack, extricated his arm and then his body. But in spite of all his efforts to free himself from the shot, he felt it dragging him down still lower. He then bent his body, and by a desperate effort severed the cord that bound his legs at the very moment when it seemed as if he were actually strangled. With a mighty leap, he rose to the surface of the sea, while the shot dragged down to the depths the sack that had so nearly become his shroud. Dantès waited only to get breath, and then dived, in order to avoid being seen. When he arose a second time, he was 50 paces from where he had first sunk. He saw overhead a black and tempestuous sky, across which the wind was driving clouds that occasionally suffered a twinkling star to appear. Before him was the vast expanse of waters, somber and terrible, whose waves foamed and roared as if before the approach of a storm. Behind him, blacker than the sea, blacker than the sky, rose phantom-like the vast stone structure, whose projecting crags seemed like arms extended to seize their prey, and on the highest rock was a torch lighting 2 figures. He fancied that these 2 forms were looking at the sea. Doubtless these strange grave diggers had heard his cry. Dantès dived again and remained a long time beneath the water. This was an easy feat to him, for he usually attracted a crowd of spectators in the bay before the lighthouse at Marseille when he swam there, and was unanimously declared to be the best swimmer in the port. When he came up again, the light had disappeared. He must now get his bearings. Ratonneau and Pomègue are the nearest islands of all those that surround the Château d'If. But Ratonneau and Pomègue are inhabited, as is also the islet of Daume. Tiboulen and Le Maire were therefore the safest for Dantès' venture. The islands of Tiboulen and Le Maire are a league from the Château d'If. Dantès, nevertheless, determined to make for them. But how could he find his way in the darkness of the night? At this moment he saw the light of Planier, gleaming in front of him like a star. By leaving this light on his right, he kept the island of Tiboulen a little on the left. By turning to the left, therefore, he would find it. But as we have said, it was at least a league from the Château d'If to this point. Often in prison, Faria had said to him, when he saw him idle and inactive, "Dantès, you must not give way to this listlessness. You will be drowned if you seek to escape, and your strength has not been properly exercised and prepared for exertion." These words rang in Dantès' ears, even beneath the waves. He hastened to cleave his way through them to see if he had not lost his strength. He found with pleasure that his captivity had taken away nothing of his power, and that he was still master of that element on whose bosom he had so often sported as a boy. Fear, that relentless pursuer, clogged Dantès' efforts. He listened for any sound that might be audible, and every time that he rose to the top of a wave, he scanned the horizon and strove to penetrate the darkness. He fancied that every wave behind him was a pursuing boat, and he redoubled his exertions, increasing rapidly his distance from the chateau, but exhausting his strength. He swam on still, and already the terrible chateau had disappeared in the darkness. He could not see it, but he felt its presence. An hour passed, during which Dantès, excited by the feeling of freedom, continued to cleave the waves.
"Let us see," said he. "I have swum above an hour, but as the wind is against me, that has retarded my speed. However, if I am not mistaken, I must be close to Tiboulen." But what if I were mistaken? A shudder passed over him. He sought to tread water in order to rest himself, but the sea was too violent, and he felt that he could not make use of this means of recuperation. "Well," said he, "I will swim on until I am worn out, or the cramp seizes me, and then I shall sink." And he struck out with the energy of despair. Suddenly the sky seemed to him to become still darker and more dense, and heavy clouds seemed to sweep down towards him. At the same time he felt a sharp pain in his knee. He fancied for a moment that he had been shot, and listened for the report, but he heard nothing. Then he put out his hand and encountered an obstacle, and with another stroke knew that he had gained the shore. Before him rose a grotesque mass of rocks that resembled nothing so much as a vast fire petrified at the moment of its most fervent combustion. It was the island of Tiboulen. Dantès rose, advanced a few steps, and with a fervent prayer of gratitude stretched himself on the granite, which seemed to him softer than down. Then, in spite of the wind and rain, he fell into the deep, sweet sleep of utter exhaustion. At the expiration of an hour, Edmund was awakened by the roar of thunder. The tempest was let loose and beating the atmosphere with its mighty wings. From time to time, a flash of lightning stretched across the heavens like a fiery serpent, lighting up the clouds that rolled on in vast, chaotic waves. Dantès had not been deceived. He had reached the first of the two islands, which was, in fact, Tiboulen. He knew that it was barren and without shelter, but when the sea became more calm, he resolved to plunge into its waves again and swim to Lemaire, equally arid, but larger, and consequently better adapted for concealment. An overhanging rock offered him a temporary shelter, and scarcely had he availed himself of it when the tempest burst forth in all its fury. Edmund felt the trembling of the rock beneath which he lay. The waves, dashing themselves against it, wetted him with their spray. He was safely sheltered, and yet he felt dizzy in the midst of the warring of the elements and the dazzling brightness of the lightning. It seemed to him that the island trembled to its base, and that it would, like a vessel at anchor, break moorings and bear him off into the center of the storm. He then recollected that he had not eaten or drunk for 24 hours. He extended his hands and drank greedily of the rain water that had lodged in the hollow of the rock. As he rose, a flash of lightning that seemed to rive the remotest heights of heaven illumined the darkness. By its light, between the islands of Lemaire and Cape Croissel, a quarter of a league distant, Dantès saw a fishing boat driven rapidly like a spectre before the power of winds and waves. A second after, he saw it again, approaching with frightful rapidity. Dantès cried at the top of his voice to warn them of their danger, but they saw it themselves. Another flash showed him 4 men clinging to the shattered mast and the rigging, while a 5th clung to the broken rudder. The men he beheld saw him undoubtedly, for their cries were carried to his ears by the wind. Above the splintered mast, a sail rent to tatters was waving. Suddenly, the ropes that still held it gave way, and it disappeared in the darkness of the night like a vast seabird. At the same moment, a violent crash was heard, and cries of distress. Dantès, from his rocky perch, saw the shattered vessel, and among the fragments the floating forms of the hapless sailors. Then all was dark again. Dantès ran down the rocks at the risk of being himself dashed to pieces. He listened, he groped about, but he heard and saw nothing. The cries had ceased, and the tempest continued to rage. By degrees the wind abated. Vast gray clouds rolled toward the west, and the blue firmament appeared studded with bright stars. Soon a red streak became visible in the horizon. The waves whitened, a light played over them and gilded their foaming crests with gold. It was day. Dantès stood mute and motionless before this majestic spectacle, as if he now beheld it for the first time. And indeed, since his captivity in the Château d'If, he had forgotten that such scenes were ever to be witnessed. He turned towards the fortress and looked at both sea and land. The gloomy building rose from the bosom of the ocean with imposing majesty and seemed to dominate the scene. It was about 5 o'clock. the sea continued to get calmer. In 2 or 3 hours, thought Dantes, the turnkey will enter my chamber, find the body of my poor friend, recognize it, seek for me in vain, and give the alarm. Then the tunnel will be discovered. The men who cast me into the sea and who must have heard the cry I uttered will be questioned. Then boats filled with armed soldiers will pursue the wretched fugitive. The cannon will warn everyone to refuse shelter to a man wandering about naked and famished. The police of Marseille will be on the alert by land, whilst the governor pursues me by sea. I am cold, I am hungry, I have lost even the knife that saved me. Oh, my God, I have suffered enough, surely. Have pity on me, and do for me what I am unable to do for myself. As Dantes, his eyes turned in the direction of the Chateau d'If, uttered this prayer, he saw off the farther point of the island of Pomègue a small vessel with lateen sail skimming the sea like a gull in search of prey, and with his sailor's eye he knew it to be a Genoese tartan. She was coming out of Marseille harbor and was standing out to sea rapidly, her sharp prow cleaving through the waves. "Oh," cried Edmund, "to think that in half an hour I could join her, did I not fear being questioned, detected, and conveyed back to Marseille. What can I do? What story can I invent? Under pretext of trading along the coast, these men, who are in reality smugglers, will prefer selling me to doing a good action. I must wait. But I cannot. I am starving. In a few hours my strength will be utterly exhausted. Besides, perhaps I have not been missed at the fortress. I can pass as one of the sailors wrecked last night. My story will be accepted, for there was no one left to contradict me." As he spoke, Dantes looked toward the spot where the fishing vessel had been wrecked, and started. The red cap of one of the sailors hung to a point of the rock, and some timbers that had formed part of the vessel's keel floated at the foot of the crag. In an instant Dantes's plan was formed. He swam to the cap, placed it on his head, seized one of the timbers, and struck out so as to cut across the course the vessel was taking. "I am saved," murmured he, and this conviction restored his strength. He soon saw that the vessel, with the wind dead ahead, was tacking between the Chateau d'If and the Tower of Planier. For an instant he feared lest, instead of keeping to shore, she should stand out to sea, but he soon saw that she would pass, like most vessels bound for Italy, between the islands of Jaros and Calasareigne. However, the vessel and the swimmer insensibly neared one another, and in one of its tacks the tartan bore down within 1/4 of a mile of him. He rose on the waves, making signs of distress, but no one on board saw him, and the vessel stood on another tack. Dantes would have shouted, but he knew that the wind would drown his voice. It was then he rejoiced at his precaution in taking the timber, for without it he would have been unable perhaps to reach the vessel, certainly to return to shore, should he be unsuccessful in attracting attention. Dantes, though almost sure as to what course the vessel would take, had yet watched it anxiously until it tacked and stood towards him. Then he advanced, and before they could meet, the vessel again changed her course. By a violent effort he half rose out of the water, waving his cap and uttering a loud shout peculiar to sailors. This time he was both seen and heard, and the tartan instantly steered towards him. At the same time he saw they were about to lower the boat. An instant after, the boat, rowed by 2 men, advanced rapidly towards him. Dantes let go of the timber, which he now thought to be useless, and swam vigorously to meet them. But he had reckoned too much upon his strength, and then he realized how serviceable the timber had been to him. His arms became stiff, his legs lost their flexibility, and he was almost breathless. He shouted again. The 2 sailors redoubled their efforts, and one of them cried in Italian, "Courage!" The word reached his ear as a wave, which he no longer had the strength to surmount, passed over his head. He rose again to the surface, struggled with the last desperate effort of a drowning man, uttered a 3rd cry, and felt himself sinking as if the fatal cannon shot were again tied to his feet. The water passed over his head, and the sky turned gray. A convulsive movement again brought him to the surface. He felt himself seized by the hair, then he saw and heard nothing. He had fainted. When he opened his eyes, Dantès found himself on the deck of the tartan. His first care was to see what course they were taking. They were rapidly leaving the Chateau d'If behind. Dantès was so exhausted that the exclamation of joy he uttered was mistaken for a sigh. As we have said, he was lying on the deck. A sailor was rubbing his limbs with a woolen cloth. Another, whom he recognized as the one who had cried out courage, held a gourd full of rum to his mouth, while the third, an old sailor, at once the pilot and captain, looked on with that egotistical pity men feel for a misfortune that they have escaped yesterday and which may overtake them tomorrow. A few drops of the rum restored suspended animation, while the friction of his limbs restored their elasticity. "Who are you?" said the pilot in bad French. "I am," replied Dantès in bad Italian, "a Maltese sailor. We were coming from Syracuse laden with grain. The storm of last night overtook us at Cape Morgeau, and we were wrecked on these rocks." "Where do you come from?" "From these rocks that I had the good luck to cling to while our captain and the rest of the crew were lost. I saw your vessel, and fearful of being left to perish on the desolate island, I swam off on a piece of wreckage to try and intercept your course. You have saved my life, and I thank you," continued Dantès. "I was lost when one of your sailors caught hold of my hair." "It was I," said a sailor of a frank and manly appearance, "and it was time, for you were sinking." "Yes," returned Dantès, holding out his hand, "I thank you again." "I almost hesitated, though," replied the sailor. "You looked more like a brigand than an honest man, with your beard 6 inches and your hair a foot long." Dantès recollected that his hair and beard had not been cut all the time he was at the Chateau d'If. "Yes," said he, "I made a vow to Our Lady of the Grotto not to cut my hair or beard for 10 years if I were saved in a moment of danger, but today the vow expires." "Now, what are we to do with you?" said the captain. "Alas, anything you please. My captain is dead. I have barely escaped, but I am a good sailor. Leave me at the first port you make. I shall be sure to find employment." "Do you know the Mediterranean?" "I have sailed over it since my childhood." "You know the best harbors?" "There are a few ports that I could not enter or leave with a bandage over my eyes." "I say, captain," said the sailor who had cried courage to Dantès, "if what he says is true, what hinders his staying with us?" "If he says true," said the captain doubtingly, "but in his present condition he will promise anything and take his chance of keeping it afterwards." "I will do more than I promise," said Dantès. "We shall see," returned the other, smiling. "Where are you going?" asked Dantès. "To Leghorn." "Then why, instead of tacking so frequently, do you not sail nearer the wind?" "Because we should run straight on to the island of Rion. You shall pass it by 20 fathoms." "Take the helm, and let us see what you know." The young man took the helm, felt to see if the vessel answered the rudder promptly, and seeing that, without being a first-rate sailor, she yet was tolerably obedient. "To the sheets," said he. The 4 seamen who composed the crew obeyed, while the pilot looked on. "Haul taut!" They obeyed. "Belay!" This order was also executed, and the vessel passed, as Dantès had predicted, 20 fathoms to windward. "Bravo!" said the captain. "Bravo!" repeated the sailors, and they all looked with astonishment at this man whose eye now disclosed an intelligence and his body a vigor they had not thought him capable of showing. "You see," said Dantès, quitting the helm, "I shall be of some use to you, at least during the voyage. If you do not want me at Leghorn, you could leave me there, and I will pay you out of the first wages I get, for my food and the clothes you lend me." "Ah," said the captain, "we can agree very well, if you are reasonable." "Give me what you give the others, and it will be all right," returned Dantès. "That's not fair," said the seaman who had saved Dantès, "for you know more than we do." "What is that to you, Jacopo?" "Jacopo? Jacopo? We'll have to decide how to pronounce that." "Jacopo," returned the captain. "Everyone is free to ask what he pleases." "That's true," replied Jacopo. "I only made a remark." "Well, you would do much better to find him a jacket and a pair of trousers, if you have them." "No," said Jacopo, "but I have a shirt and a pair of trousers." "That is all I want," interrupted Dantès. Jacopo dived into the hold and soon returned with what Edmund wanted. "Now then, do you wish for anything else?" said the patron. "A piece of bread and another glass of the capital rum I tasted, for I have not eaten or drunk for a long time." He had not tasted food for 40 hours. A piece of bread was brought, and Jacopo offered him the gourd. "Larboard your helm!" cried the captain to the steersman. Dantes glanced that way as he lifted the gourd to his mouth, then paused with hand in mid-air. "Hullo! What's the matter at the Chateau d'If?" said the captain. A small white cloud, which had attracted Dantes's attention, crowned the summit of the bastion of the Chateau d'If. At the same moment, the faint report of a gun was heard. The sailors looked at one another. "What is that?" asked the captain. "A prisoner has escaped from the Chateau d'If, and they are firing the alarm gun," replied Dantes. The captain glanced at him, but he had lifted the rum to his lips and was drinking it with so much composure that suspicions, if the captain had any, died away. "Pretty strong rum," said Dantes, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "At any rate," murmured he, "if it be, so much the better, for I have made a rare acquisition." Under pretense of being fatigued, Dantes asked to take the helm. The steersman, glad to be relieved, looked at the captain, and the latter by a sign indicated that he might abandon it to his new comrade. Dantes could thus keep his eyes on Marseille. "What is the day of the month?" asked he of Jacopo, who sat down beside him. "The 28th of February." "In what year?" "In what year? You ask me in what year?" "Yes," replied the young man. "I ask you in what year." "You have forgotten that?" "I got such a fright last night," replied Dantes, smiling, "that I have almost lost my memory. I ask you, what year is it?" "The year 1829, replied Jacopo. It was 14 years, day for day, since Dantes's arrest. He was 19 when he entered the Chateau d'If. He was 33 when he escaped. A sorrowful smile passed over his face. He asked himself what had become of Mercédès, who must believe him dead. Then his eyes lighted up with hatred as he thought of the 3 men who had caused him so long and wretched a captivity. He renewed against Danglars, Fernand, and Villefort the oath of implacable vengeance he had made in his dungeon. This oath was no longer a vain menace, for the fastest sailor in the Mediterranean would have been unable to overtake the little tartan that with every stitch of canvas set was flying before the wind till Leghorn. And that concludes chapter 20 and 21 of The Count of Monte Cristo. Thank you for joining me today. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow for Bastille Day and 2 more chapters of The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Thank you very much, and I'll see you then. Bye.